Opel time. Let me introduce to you my daily, a 2005 Opel Corsa 1.7 CDTI, also known as Doris. But why of all cars that exist did I choose to daily this particular one? Surely there are better options, I hear you say. Well, let me give you at least two reasons. Starting with this magnificent thing. This is the Z17 DTH, a Circle L family engine developed by Isuzu in conjunction with General Motors. It began being installed in the late 90s and all the way up to 2014, and with a good reason. It's an amazing little power plant. Oh my god, it is just so good. Originally built in the Polish Isuzu plant, but all the engine blocks originated from Japan. And we all know how they are with their standards. The first thing I gotta mention is the torque. Yeah, I know it's a diesel, it's supposed to be torquey, but I don't know what it is with these engines. They just seem like they have more oomph. It's like they're constructed alternatively. The early ones weren't that powerful, they've only had like 170 Newton meters of torque, but around 2003 the common rail versions came out and then these became really fun. This one is the weaker version, but it still got 101 horsepower and 240 Newton meters of torque. I mean, it's not slow. Before I did the engine swap on the BMW, this one had more torque. A little fun fact, because this was the most powerful Corsa on the market at the time, at least torque-wise, I mean it was this or the GSI, this one got the front brakes of the 1.8 Astra. There's barely any space here. And you'll notice that this is the only Corsa C that has 5 lug bolts, which is also the reason why I can't get nice wheels for it. Damn you, 5x110! Then there's fuel consumption. This one will do 5 or 5.5 liters per 100 kilometers easily. I managed to get it to 4.5 as well, but even if you're really pushing it, giving it all the beans she can handle, she's not gonna go above 6.5. No way. And because it was such a good engine, GM just kept putting it into cars. Nearly all of the Opel lineup got one in some shape or form, excluding the bigger cars like the Vectra and the Insignia. Although in my opinion, this would still be the better choice than that stupid Fiat junk. And we all know what Fiat stands for, don't we?
Fix it again, Tony!
Anyways, some European market Chevys used it as well, and also Honda, the 7th generation Civic here in Europe, had it. And for the nautical people watching, you may know this as the Mercruiser 1.7 Cummins. When you go read the forums about the engine, doesn't matter which platform it's in, you'll always hear things like reliability, good mileage, and torque. And the first one is the most important for me. I want all of my time working on cars to be spent on project cars, and I don't want to bother with fixing up the daily. So this is the perfect option. Over my 5 years of ownership, I've never had any problems with it whatsoever. Just change the oil every year, the oil filter and an air filter every couple of years, and we're golden. Sadly though, that meant this little car got neglected more than she deserves. She's all dirty, the engine has developed some oil leaks which I can no longer ignore, and she's due for a tech inspection as well. The underside also started collecting some rust, which will need some attention in the future. So, why bother? Like I said, I don't want to spend time working on the daily. Why not just get a new car, maybe an Astra, it's got the same engine, but it's a bigger, more comfortable car. Yeah, but do I need a bigger car? I've always gravitated more to nuggets anyway, and Doris is pretty much family at this point. She's been with me for 5 years already, so why not have her around for another 10 at least? So that is why I decided that I'm not going to abandon her, I'm gonna fix her up, and I'm gonna fix her up real good. Starting with the engine. Looking at the car from underneath, it looked like most of the oil was leaking from the crack between the engine and the transmission, which usually means a bad rear main seal. And to replace it, the transmission had to be removed. But to get access to the transmission, I needed to take off the front subframe and the exhaust. Taking off the exhaust revealed that the rear muffler, which was still the original part, already had a couple of holes in it, and it was probably best to replace it. I didn't know it at the time, but the rear muffler was only the first thing on the list of many that's gonna need to be replaced. To remove the front subframe, I needed to unbolt the lower control arms, the sway bar end links, and the tie rods. It turned out later on that I didn't need to remove the tie rods because the steering rack was staying in the car, but I did anyway, and one wouldn't come off. It just kept spinning, so I cut it. And no, it did not make me angry. That's it, moving on. Well, was this necessary? It turns out no. You know what they say, we're making a mother of all omelets, Jack. You can't fret over every egg. And because the steering rack was staying in the car, I had to remove the sway bar, which is positioned exactly above it. I also removed the drive shafts, then I unbolted the steering rack from the subframe, and it was really tight. Tighter than it should have been. Why that was the case, you'll find out soon enough. After I unbolted the engine and gearbox supports, the subframe could come out.
A little bit of rust, but not horrible.
Because the subframe supports the radiator, intercooler and AC condenser, I had to tie them up to get some space. Then I had to support the engine, because the whole engine and transmission assembly are supported by the transmission mount, which needed to be removed. To get to the support hook though, I had to move the charge pipe out of the way by removing it from the "what do you mean small, it's at least average sized" turbo.
There we go. Ooh, look at the little turbo.
Before I could get the transmission off, I had to disconnect the shifter linkage, the clutch line and the reverse gear position sensor. I emptied out the gearbox oil and, cause it still looked pretty clear, I stored it to reuse it later. The next thing was the starter. Removing it gave me a little glimpse into the state of things in the bell housing.
Mayonnaise.
All that was left now was to lower the engine and unbolt the transmission, and together with my dad we pulled it off. That was like opening the Pandora's box. A decent amount of oil came out immediately after we pulled it off, and beside the oil, the whole bell housing and engine block were covered in a special substance that you get when you mix clutch/brake dust with engine oil. It's like someone's been trying to make the car equivalent of the human cake. After cleaning out the bigger chunks from the block, I washed it thoroughly with brake cleaner and then I cleaned up the transmission as well. When all the parts were cleaned, I replaced the rear main seal and started putting everything back together.
Lubrication. Oh, you forgot to lube this.
Yeah. And while we're here, I'd like to say a couple of things about the gearbox. This is the F23 Getrag Gearbox, and it was used for 2-liter and 2.2-liter diesel Opels, but also the performance versions of Opel cars, the OPCs, like the Astra and Zafira. And it's used in some American cars too, like the Chevy Cobalt, the economy version though, not the SS. Apparently it's a really popular gearbox in the Ecotech racing community, and it's also apparently really strong. I've seen some claims of it being used in some 600 horsepower plus setups. It has a pretty good aftermarket support, so if I ever wished for an LSD, there is always an option. I just think that's neat. Anyway, back with the build. After I reinstalled the flywheel and the clutch, the transmission was ready to be put back in. And that is when my dad noticed that there was some coolant leaking from the thermostat housing, which meant it had to be resealed. Which could have been done later, but let me put it this way. These Circle L engines are pretty easy to work on. Even in a small chassis like the Corsa, you can generally reach everything you need. The exception, of course, is the thermostat housing. The problem is that the bolts for the EGR valve, which you have to remove, are screwed in from underneath, and they are pretty easy to remove. If the transmission is not in the car, that is. That's why we're doing it now. To get to the thermostat housing, I had to take off the throttle body and the exhaust gas recirculation valve, or EGR. To do that though, the engine support had to be removed and the engine supported from below. To get more access, I also removed the ECU, conveniently located on the top of the engine, and the intake pipe. After removing the EGR valve, the thermostat housing could come out. I cleaned out the old sealant from the housing and the head, applied fresh sealant, and bada bing, bada boom, the thermostat housing was reinstalled. Since I had the EGR off, it was a perfect opportunity to clean it out and remove all the burnt diesel gunk that has accumulated in the past 18 years. I also cleaned the throttle body and put everything back together. In the next attempt to install the transmission, it was brought to my attention that my flywheel had developed an abnormal amount of play and it needed to be replaced. And cause I'm already doing the flywheel, the clutch is also pretty worn, so let's just get a whole set with a new clutch and a throttle bearing as well. While I waited for the parts to be delivered, I decided to tackle some other oil leaks, because of course there is more, the front main seal being one of them. Here I have committed a stage 1 federal oopsie, as for some reason I thought that the engine uses a timing chain, not a belt. And while removing the auxiliary belt pulley, I accidentally pulled the timing belt pulley off with it. Here you can observe in real time how the realization of what I just did sinks in. So now I'm gonna have to set the timing. To get access to all the oil behind the timing belt cover, I had to remove it. And to do that, I had to take off the other engine mount, which meant the engine had to be supported from below again. And while we're already taking the timing belt cover off, and the engine has to be retimed anyway, let's just replace the timing belt and the pulleys. But why stop there? Let's do the water pump as well. Of course, before I did all that, I replaced the front main seal. With about 5 to 10 years of maintenance done, I reassembled everything and reinstalled the engine mount. Now let's move on to the oil leak number 3. One interesting design that these engines have is that they have a vacuum pump mounted on the alternator that is being driven by a shaft that goes through and also drives the alternator. This vacuum pump uses engine oil for lubrication, and with time the O-rings sealing this oil go bad and your alternator literally starts leaking oil. It's an interesting phenomenon, and you're sure to confuse people not familiar with this engine, wondering how the hell is oil coming out of the alternator. I took the alternator off, cleaned it up, removed the vacuum pump, cleaned that as well, and replaced the O-rings with new ones that I've got custom made. After that, I assembled everything and installed the alternator into the car. And then it was time to tackle the last oil leak. As you can see on the valve cover on these engines, there are holes for the fuel injectors / lines, 8 in total, 4 for fuel supply and 4 for return. The holes are sealed with special seals that in my case have gone bad, and because there is high pressure oil spraying all around the valve train, some of it makes it out through the seals. So I needed new seals. It's a very simple job, you just have to be super careful when removing the lines from the injectors, you wouldn't want to break the tiny plastic inserts. I cleaned up the valve cover and replaced the seals one by one. With that done, I could also reinstall the ECU. In the meantime, the clutch and flywheel kit had arrived, which meant the transmission could be put back into the car. Third time's the charm, they say. The old throwout bearing was taken out and replaced with a new one, and the flywheel and clutch were put on the engine. Just before me and my dad popped the transmission back on, we also removed the driveshaft seals that were also leaking, as it was easier to do it now. New seals were ordered and the transmission was put on the car. The engine / transmission mount was reinstalled, and we also bled the clutch. The next day when the seals arrived, I had to put them in. Luckily, I found a pipe that was just the right diameter and used that to hammer them in. Okay, stop. You know those pictures seconds before disaster? Well, you're looking at one now. You see that little circle on the right side of the screen? That is a spring from one of those seals I just installed. The spring is necessary for these shaft seals to provide a good seal, and it can't be installed from the front. Luckily, I remembered which seal I dropped, so I knew which one I needed to take out. Unluckily, taking it out wasn't gonna be an easy task. I already knew there is no way of getting it out without damaging it. The thing I was more worried about was damaging the surface on the transmission housing where it is installed. Let's just say that the process of taking it out was a stressful 3 hours. That time I also replaced one of the auxiliary belt pulleys that was on its way out. The next day I got another seal, which meant I could try again. No problems this time, it went in pretty nicely, and after that I could install the drive shafts and then fill up the gearbox oil.
Perfect.
I replaced the air filter and reassembled the airbox, as well as all the little things that need to be reassembled, filled up the coolant reservoir and finished up the assembly with the valve cover plastic. I really wanted to start her up, so I checked if there was still enough oil inside after all the leaking, and it was enough. Not like full, but enough. So it was time to start her up and see if she bends a valve while I'm still in my overalls. She was a bit stubborn at first, but after trying for a little bit, she started up every time.
Okay.
The clutch needed to be bled a little bit more, and you might not even notice, but that's what she sounds like without the exhaust.
Alright.
She's a real diesel grunt even with the exhaust on, so that was the next thing on the menu. Next weekend it was time to tackle the exhaust. I've already shown you the state of the rear muffler, but it turns out the flex pipe was bad as well. The replacement one was one that was the same diameter as the exhaust. It wasn't one of those where it just slips on, so I had to be really precise with the cutting. I installed the pipe back on the car so I could mark out where exactly I needed to cut it. While cutting, I again removed the pipe from the car and then I put it back on to see how the new flex pipe would fit. Before that, I also put on the new muffler. I didn't clamp it on or anything, I just put it on so that the whole pipe would be in its original position. I was very happy with the position of the new flex pipe, so after carefully positioning it into place, I tack welded it on the car. Then I took the whole exhaust off and welded it for real. I'm not super proud of these welds, but they should hold and shouldn't leak. To finish off the exhaust, I installed the rear muffler, properly this time. Remember when I said that the bolts for the steering rack were really tight? Well, that was because they were really rusty. So rusty in fact that their diameter was smaller in the middle where the rust was, which meant that I needed new bolts. I couldn't find any that were high enough grade, so I eventually decided to yoink them out of this Astra parts car. They were a little longer, so I shortened them and used them to bolt up the steering rack. One last thing to mention, I also did a service. It was well over a year since the last one, and even though I didn't put that many kilometers on the car, I still wanted to put fresh oil in because I'm a good owner who does his oil changes regularly. This is where I'm going to end the video. Just to let you know, the car is already done. She passed tech inspection with flying colors and she's now registered and mechanically ready for new adventures. For the last couple of things I didn't record because I wanted to hurry up with the car. What I did is I replaced pretty much all the rear brake lines and also some suspension components. I also sprayed the whole underside of the car with a special protective wax, and I'm planning on dealing with rust in the summer. I'm planning on doing a couple of more mods on the car just to make it more ergonomic, so stay tuned for that. For now, I'd like to say thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!